they're basically competing not necessarily against other streamers, but against the attention economy of where people are spending their time and their attention. To get people to go to a movie theater and have that collective experience, I think it has to be a big piece of IP that people really want to have that experience where they can laugh, cry, and smile with their friends.
First it was TV, then streaming and AI. For years, people have been predicting the death of Hollywood. But with the current drama around the sale of Warner Brothers, some are saying now the moment of reckoning really has arrived. To talk about that, I'm joined by Paul Hardart, Director of the Entertainment, Media and Technology Programme at NYU Stern School of Business and a former executive at Universal Pictures and Warner Brothers. Paul, really good to have you with us today. Now, you used to work in the movie business yourself. Do you think Hollywood has finally reached its not so happy ending?
No, I think this is a tectonic shift in the way that we're going to think about Hollywood, and it definitely is going to be a change. One of the major studios will effectively be absorbed into a bigger company. So it's not great news for the creative ecosystem. Obviously, in any kind of business, you want a diverse number of competitors. So this is consolidation leads to fewer competitors, fewer choice, and therefore fewer buyers. So that's not great news. But Hollywood technology has always challenged Hollywood, whether it's the advent of the VHS or television or the DVD. But always, storytelling is sort of fundamental to human nature, and I think we're just going to find new ways of telling stories. But yeah, so it is a major shift, but obviously it's not the end of Hollywood or storytelling.
All right, let's get into the business story then. Can you explain why Warner Brothers is for sale in the first place?
Yes, Warner Brothers has been sort of passed around quite a bit over the last several years, right? Initially, it was sold to AT&T. The idea of sort of pairing content and distribution on our phones, that deal did not work out. Then it was spun off to Discovery. The idea that Discovery and these channels could make something good. I think always the plan was to maybe sell it. That has not worked out either. So ultimately, they have a huge amount of debt and they don't have the scale. So I think a deal, whether it's with Paramount, whether it would be with Comcast, or whether it would be with Netflix, is almost essential to the long-term viability of the studio.
Right, so at the moment it seems that the main contenders are Netflix and Paramount. Can you walk us through how their offers differ?
Yeah, they're sort of apples. They're not really apples to apples comparison. So what Netflix is offering is a little over $27 for just the studio, the Warner Brothers Studios, the library, the actual lot in Burbank, and then HBO Max. What Paramount is asking is for the entire thing, and that includes all the cable networks, which would include places like CNN, TNT, TBS, Turner Classic Movies. So they're two different offers for two different elements of the business. Warner Brothers' plan originally was to spin off its cable networks, very much like Comcast has done, into this company called Versant. So basically taking the cable networks and spinning off into a separate company. That was the intention for Warner Brothers. And then Paramount, David Ellison, came in and made a deal for the offer for the entire company. In that got the interest of other potential buyers, including Comcast and Netflix. And Netflix then offered just for those pieces that they were interested in, the studio, the library, and HBO Max. So that's how they differ.
Sure. So Trump has already weighed in on this battle, but I'm wondering, how does regulatory approval actually work in this case? Who is ultimately responsible for greenlighting a deal of this kind?
Great question. So, normally, we just saw this, when Paramount was bought by David Ellison, they had to go through FTC approval. The reason that being is that there was a broadcast network, CBS Broadcast, and that spectrum is granted by the federal the FCC, and then the FTC would be probably the voice here of whether or not this is anti-monopolistic. And so the concern would be that there is a little bit of a finger on the scale. Trump likes the media business. I think he likes being involved in the discussions. As you probably have read, that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's company, Affinity Partners, is one of the debt providers to Paramount. So there are a lot of elements here. Ted Sarandos, who's a charming guy, also has spoken to Trump. So it will be ultimately interesting how this plays out. In the end of the day, right, what Paramount is doing is they're going directly to the shareholders, and the question for the shareholders is, do we want cash, right, which would be coming from Paramount, or do we want the Netflix deal? And it's a bit of a question of long-term versus short-term, right? Short-term, we'll get probably more money, cleaner, might have a clear path for regulatory reasons because Trump is close to the Ellisons. But there's also a little bit of financial risk, right? They have a fair amount of financing coming out of the Middle East. So whereas Netflix is a $400 billion company, it's a little cleaner in that regard. So they're both very different deals. I think this story is not over. I think we will see, the good news for David Zaslav and Warner Brothers is having two large potential buyers. That means that they can probably eke out a little more. In fact, David Ellison has even said that $30 a share is not their final offer.
What is your sense of who will win out in the end?
It's a great question. Initially I thought that Netflix would. I mean, to me, neither of these are great for the general ecosystem of Hollywood. Like we talked about, it will reduce the number of buyers. I originally thought, I think most people thought that Paramount would get it because to some degree, what Netflix did was sort of play a little bit of possum and say that they weren't interested. So I think they did kind of come out of nowhere and surprised a lot of people. It does make sense for Netflix, right? Netflix spends about $18 billion a year on content. So if you look at it just from those numbers, that's about 5 years worth of content spend. And for that, they would get one of the most iconic film libraries in history, including things like the DC comics, Superman, Batman, Harry Potter, Friends, Game of Thrones. So in some ways, it is a really appealing thing for Netflix. For Paramount, I would argue it's a little more existential. They bought Paramount. They don't have the scale, and they definitely would need more content and more subscribers that they'd get from HBO Max. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. At some point, right, it's going to come down to price. And that's what David Zaslav is in a pretty good position to navigate that.
If I could just return to the regulatory issue for a moment, given that streaming platforms operate on a global scale, would international agencies potentially be involved in this too?
Definitely. I think particularly in Europe, I think they may take their lead from the US in that regard. But the argument that these companies will say from a regulatory standpoint is people do have a lot of choice. Increasingly, I think Netflix would argue that they only make up about 5 to 8% of people's viewing time. So competitors like TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube. So I think their view is they're basically competing not necessarily against other streamers, but against the attention economy of where people are spending their time and their attention.
Right. And you mentioned the political angle as well, with the Ellison family having close ties to Donald Trump. The Guardian newspaper actually reported that there'd been conversations about firing certain CNN hosts that Trump disliked if Paramount took over. How worried should we be about the increasing politicization of the media landscape in the US?
Well, we've seen it happen, right? We saw that ABC settled with Disney settled with the Trump administration for what George Stephanopoulos said on air. We also saw it with the 60 Minutes settlement. So it is a unique time in American history where a president does sort of go after media companies, and a lot of them have chosen to settle versus fight these. I think part of the reason is that Trump does have a lot of sway within sort of the regulatory and also in terms of giving out favors to various companies. So I think it is challenging, but we have to keep in mind, right? Trump is president now. Trump will not always be president, and I think these companies have to think about where they want to be in the long term, from both a brand perspective and also from an operating perspective.
All right. And just as a final question for you, if you look into the future, we're already seeing a kind of a backlash against the use of AI in the creative world. Do you think we could ever see a return to a kind of golden age of cinema, with people returning to movie theaters for a much more collective, old school experience? Or do you really think those days are gone?
I think you will. I think you will continue to see, one of the challenges for the Netflix offers is Netflix traditionally is not a company that likes the theatrical window. That said, I think people, particularly coming out of the pandemic, young people, which I deal with fairly frequently, they do like having in real life experiences. So I think if there are movies, oftentimes it's the bigger budgeted movies that it is a real experience, whether that's from visual effects, whether that's from Dolby sound, whether that's from an IMAX experience. I think people do want an experience. I think they will be fewer. I think the smaller movies, you can watch at home. People have, following the pandemic, they've gotten more comfortable couches, they've gotten bigger TVs, and also a lot of people are very comfortable just scrolling on their phone. So I think to get people to go to a movie theater and have that collective experience, I think it has to be a big sort of piece of IP that people really want to have that experience where they can laugh, cry, and smile with their friends in that collective, larger format.
And that takes investment, doesn't it? Paul Hardart, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Delightful. Appreciate it. Thanks, Kate.